first turning and the end of woke. I'm going to talk about the Strauss-Howe theory of generational cycles and why it means that the divisive woke culture of recent years is going to fade away, and we should be moving into a more easygoing and upbeat kind of era. Now, some people love the Strauss-Howe theory and other people hate it, so I'm going to take my time to go through it. I'll start with the basic concepts, and then I'll give my own interpretation of the theory. And this is going to get a bit technical because I think it's important to show that the theory is logical and credible. And after that, I'll show how we can measure the cycle using Russia as an example. And it will turn out that the Russian cycle is a bit different. And lastly, I'll talk about what the theory predicts for the next couple of decades and why we should expect the end of woke activism. So in the 1990s, William Strauss and Neil Howe brought out two books, Generations and its sequel, The Fourth Turning. And these are about their theory of Anglo-American generations. And what they said was that if you look back through American and British history, there has been a series of different generations, each with its own sort of outlook on life. And these aren't family generations of parent, child, grandchild, but what they call cohort generations, consisting of all the people who were born in a certain time period. So just to focus on their picture of the 20th century, they said that the people born between 1901 and 1924 were the GI generation because they were the ones who were of the right age to become GIs, American soldiers, to fight in the Second World War. And people born between 1925 and 1942 form what they call the silent generation, who came of age in the late 40s and 50s and mostly just quietly fitted into corporate life. Then people born between 1943 and 1960 are the boomers, the products of the baby boom after the Second World War, who came of age in the mid-60s and 1970s. Then people born between 1961 and 1981 are what they call the 13th generation, because they were the 13th generation since the American Declaration of Independence. And then people born between 1982 and 2004 are the millennials, who are the young adults of today. Now, what Strauss-Howe called the 13th generation is also sometimes known as Generation X, which makes the millennials Generation Y, and so the people born after the millennials are Generation Z. And Strauss-Howe didn't write about Generation Z because none of them had even been born back in the 1990s when their books came out. But Generation Z itself must be coming to an end sometime in the next few years, so we'll have to see what name the next generation picks up. Anyway, I have focused on the 20th century, but Strauss-Howe identify this succession of different generations all the way back to the 1400s, to the English Wars of the Roses. I won't go into all that detail, which isn't really necessary for what I'm going to talk about. I do recommend their books, or you can find a pretty good summary on Wikipedia. And remember that we are talking about cohort generations. So if you're a millennial, for example, your parents could be Generation X or they could be boomers. It depends on the year they were born, not on the family relationship. Now, one thing to notice is that Strauss-Howe's timing of the generations is a bit different from what some other people tend to use. For example, many people start the boomer generation at the end of the war in 1945 and end it around 1965. But Strauss-Howe say that when you are talking about the way a generation picks up a particular outlook on life, it depends on the mood of the times in which they grow up. And children less than about 3 or 4 years old are too young and too sheltered, really, to pick up on that mood. So the first kids who absorb the vibes of the end of the Second World War aren't the ones who were actually born in 1945, but the ones who were already 3 or 4 years old at that time and just becoming aware of the adult world. And they were born a few years earlier, i.e. by Strauss-Howe's reckoning in 1942, which is why they start the new generation then. And that's why their generations start a few years earlier than what are sometimes the commonly accepted dates, while more recently people seem to be jumping the gun and being impatient to define new generations. Now, I've said some things there that are jumping ahead a bit, so I need to move on to another part of the theory, which is that as well as there being different generations, there are also changing moods in society. Going back to the 20th century, in the 1930s to 40s, we had the Depression and the Second World War, a time of economic and political stresses and conflict. Then came the 1950s to early 60s, a calmer and more optimistic time, typified by the Happy Days TV series, a time of family life and steady jobs. And this morphed into the counterculture of the late 60s to 1970s, from hippies to punks and anti-war protests. Then by the 1980s to 1990s, it was the time of yuppies and wheeling and dealing, from Gordon Gekko in Wall Street saying greed is good to Del Boy in Only Fools and Horses. The same basic idea that it's all about making money and living by your wits. And some of the contrast can be seen in the film Back to the Future, which came out in 1985. Marty McFly goes back to the time of the 1950s and stands out as streetwise and independent compared to the kind of placid and conformist world of that time. And this is where Strauss-Howe stopped, because that was when they were writing. But they went on to make a prophecy for what the world would be like when the millennials started coming of age around the mid-2000s. And the reason they could make such a prophecy is because they have the idea that these social moods and generations follow a predictable pattern. So let's go back to the 1930s to 40s and the Depression and World War. This is the kind of mood that Strauss-Howe call a crisis. It's a time of political and economic troubles and challenges. But it's also a time when people confront those troubles and overcome them. There is a war to be fought, and people come forward to fight it with great energy and heroism. And earlier in the Great Depression, people rose to the challenge with the New Deal and the Public Works Administration, working together in difficult times. And so the overcoming of the crisis gives way to the next mood, which is the high, the mood of the 1950s, when society is moving forward again. The troubles are behind it, and there is a new sense of calm and order, and everything seems right with the world. But eventually the mood changes again to what Strauss-Howe call an awakening, as in the 60s and 70s, which is when people start to question the existing cultural values. They perhaps get bored, or they feel overly constrained by a conformist society, and they rebel against it, trying to find new ways of being. A typical illustration of the mood is Bob Dylan's lyrics: "Come mothers and fathers all over the land, don't criticise what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command, for the times they are a-changin'." So this is a time not of political and economic turmoil, but of cultural turmoil. And the challenge doesn't so much come from outside, like a war or a global depression, but is produced within by the society against itself. But this mood comes to an end too. It's as though the times are a-changing and the change happens on many fronts, and then society kind of moves on. And the next mood, which is like in the 80s and 90s, is what Strauss and Howe call an unravelling. People are becoming more selfish and more self-reliant. A classic illustration of it is Thatcherism, and Mrs. Thatcher's statement when she was interviewed by Woman's Own in 1987 that there is no such thing as society, just individual men and women. And she meant that people should look to themselves to solve their problems and not expect some amorphous, invisible thing called society to take responsibility for them. Such a contrast to the crisis when the problems were seen as society's problems and governments led the fight against them. And with this individualism of the unravelling, there is a feeling that things are kind of crumbling somehow. People are living well. It's quite a hedonistic time with wine bars and raves. But the world is fragmenting. People are pulling apart, not pulling together like they did in times like the crisis or the high. And Strauss and Howe say that when they look back through Anglo-American history, all the way back to the Wars of the Roses, they find that these four moods have followed each other over and over in this particular order. A crisis gives way to a high, which gives way to an awakening, which gives way to an unravelling. And then the unravelling generates a new crisis and the whole cycle starts again. And this cycle of moods is related to the succession of generations because each type of social mood leaves an imprint on the generation that grows up in it and affects the way that that generation behaves ever afterwards as it goes through life. And each generation and each mood lasts about 20 years, which is the length of the human formative period, say from 5 to 25, which is the time when we acquire our most fundamental values and feelings about the world. So let's go back to the crisis of the 30s and 40s. This is when the GI generation were young adults from about 20 to 40. They were children during the previous unravelling, the Prohibition era, which Strauss and Howe date from 1908 to 1929. And as young adults, Strauss and Howe say, they exhibited an extraordinary capacity for working in teams, and they also tended to see the world in quite black and white terms, very sure of right and wrong, and vehement about it, insisting on comradeship and being one of the crowd. These were all the qualities that allowed them to take on the immense challenges of their time and bring them to an end. And Strauss and Howe say that if you look back at previous crises and the young adults of those times, they were always like that, team workers and rather intense. And Strauss and Howe call this kind of generation a hero generation. Then move on to the high, and you have young adults who were children during the crisis, and they're also quite good team workers, but they are calmer and more easygoing. They're also technical and sensitive. Strauss and Howe call this type of generation artists because they have a liking for what might be called elite culture. They like classical music and art galleries and, are sincere about it. It may be helpful to skip ahead slightly to compare them with the young adults of the unravelling, which is someone like Marty McFly. Coming of age in the unravelling, he is tough, where those coming of age in the high are sensitive. And where the high's young adults have quite refined tastes that get more refined as they get older, Marty McFly and his ilk are basically Philistines who prefer headbanging and who never really get a taste for classical art and music. So that is the artist generation, sensitive and corporate in outlook. And Strauss and Howe say that a characteristic achievement of such a generation was the Apollo moon landings, which occurred when these artists were young adults. And they were a massive team effort, not just in NASA, but spreading across America and even across the world, with all the companies and organizations that contributed, from rocket manufacturers to radio telescope operators. This is the kind of highly complex collective effort requiring calm and rational thinking that an artist generation pulls off well. Next, we move on to the young adults of the awakening, and these are very different. They are passionate, not calm, and they are rebellious individualists, very far from being the kind of people who work well in large, complex teams. They give up their shirts and ties for caftans and beads and growing their hair long. And they are on a mission to change society, to teach it new values. So Strauss and Howe call this generation a prophet generation. They have a vision for how society ought to be, which is very different from how it actually is. And they are on a kind of crusade against the older adults and the existing order of things. And again, that's typified by Bob Dylan's lyrics, very aggressive. The times they are a-changing, and mums and dads, if you can't accept it, you need to get out of the way. So whereas heroes fix problems and artists fit in and get along, prophets find problems. They find problems with the way things are. And while artists were growing up in the crisis, prophets grew up in much easier times, in the high, and perhaps this makes them a bit spoilt and more self-assured. So that is a prophet generation. And finally, we move back to Marty McFly and his ilk. Strauss and Howe call this type of generation, which is the 13th generation or Generation X, a nomad generation. I believe they use that term because they are thinking of the prophet Moses and how the generation below him wandered in the wilderness before the Israelites finally came to the promised land. These nomads are children during the awakening, and they come of age in the unravelling. And again, they have a different outlook, as we have seen the wheeling and dealing kind of worldview. Also, as I said, tough, Philistine, self-reliant. They have one thing in common with the prophets, which is that they are individualists, but they don't have the same passion about it. They're not rebellious. They're not trying to change the world. They're just interested in making the best life for themselves, not in solving the problems of humanity. Now, Strauss and Howe recognise that when we talk about generations and their outlooks, not everyone belonging to a given generation thinks and acts in the same way. Of course, that's not the case. People aren't clones. So for a start, in every generation, you'll get some people on the right and some people on the left. So Strauss and Howe suggests that about 30% of the members of a generation are the ones who really set the tone for that generation and are sort of the influencers, fashion setters and opinion leaders. Then another roughly 50% just go along with the mood of the times and of their friends and peers. And then there are 10 to 20% who actively resist the mood of their generation and go off in a different direction. So yes, there were some people in the 60s and 70s who wanted to make money in the city, and some Generation Xers who continued the New Age lifestyle. But by and large, the type of shift from hippies to yuppies is not a figment of imagination. It's a real phenomenon that people notice and can even measure. So, for example, Strauss and Howe say, back in the late 1960s, first-year university students of the boomer generation, which was a prophet generation, believed by a 2-to-1 majority that developing a meaningful philosophy of life was more important than getting ahead financially. Then by the mid-1980s, the nomad Generation X response to this question went 2-1 in the opposite direction. And when you have studied history to the depth that Strauss and Howe have, you not only see these shifts occurring on a regular basis, roughly every 20 years, but you also see that they form this repeating pattern of generations and social moods. And there is a link because you always get the same configuration of generations in each social mood. Now, Strauss and Howe call the different moods turnings, and they actually start their cycle with the high. So putting everything together, we get this picture. The first turning is the high, and during that time, the children, roughly 0 to 20, are a profit generation, and the young adults, 20 to 40, are artists. And those of middle age, 40 to 60, would be a hero generation, which was the GI generation in the case of the last high. And lastly, the old age people, the elders, 60 to 80, would be nomads. And anyone older than that, the few that are still around, would be prophets from the previous cycle. Then in the second turning, the awakening, the prophets have moved up to be young adults, the artists are middle-aged, and the heroes are the elders, while most of the old nomads have died, but the children are a new nomad generation. Then in the third turning, the unravelling, the children are heroes, the young adults are the nomads, the prophets are middle-aged, and the artists are in old age. And finally, in the fourth turning, the crisis, the children are a new artist generation, the young adults are heroes, the middle-aged are nomads, and the elders are prophets. And as we've seen, this was the arrangement for the Depression and Second World War. And now with this picture, we can see how Strauss and Howe could make their prediction for the 2000s to 2020s. The third turning of the 80s and 90s would give way to a fourth turning starting around 2005, when the millennials, who must be a hero generation, would start to enter young adulthood. The next 2 decades would be a new crisis beset by tremendous problems, and the millennials would tackle and resolve those problems through an equally tremendous team effort. So that's the theory. At least that's some of the main points. And some people have found its forecasts for today, which were made in the 1990s, remember, to be impressively accurate. To many people, it does feel like our present time is a kind of crisis, not just the pandemic, but that society, a whole former way of life, is under attack. Strauss and Howe predicted that, quote, institutions will be increasingly bossy, limiting personal freedoms, chastising bad manners, and cleansing the culture. Well, that does sound a bit like a description of so-called cancel culture and the way that social media platforms boot off people that go against mainstream opinion. And Strauss and Howe talk of limiting personal freedoms. Well, many people feel that the freedoms they have given up over the pandemic go beyond just being a health issue and reflect a control agenda that overreaching governments wanted to bring in anyway and were just looking for an excuse. And this is not to mention the way that freedom and privacy have been eroded by the anti-terrorism measures coming in after September the 11th. And Strauss and Howe say that millennials will be allowed to linger longer in childhood. And it's well known that unlike the streetwise Generation Xers who left home quickly and were out there taking on mortgages and chasing careers, large numbers of millennials are still living at home into their 30s. Strauss and Howe also talk about the millennials acquiring a black and white view of the world from the influences they were being exposed to in childhood. They quote a journalist talking about children's TV and saying what they're learning is that life is black and white, which she calls the primary colours of censure. In other words, Strauss and Howe expected millennials to grow up with a polarised view of morals and politics, and to be quick to condemn and criticise people they don't approve of. They said that millennials will grow up to be sociable, but also somewhat bland, conformist, and dependent on others to reach judgments. Now, all this may seem like a character assassination of the millennials, but remember that as a hero generation, they are also self-sacrificing team workers who can fix society's biggest problems, which is why they are called heroes. Each generation type has both good and bad points. And Strauss and Howe say that unlike the Generation X nomads, who were criticised and demonised when young, the cherished young heroes will be praised for their moral crusading. Young Greta was celebrated by the media after lambasting the diplomats of the entire world at the United Nations. Today it's the ones the millennials object to, the Jordan Petersons of this world, who tend to be cast as hateful and divisive. Now, Strauss and Howe also talked about how a crisis era begins with a catalysing event, such as the crisis of the mid-20th century began with the catalysing event of the Wall Street crash in 1929. For the present crisis, they suggested the catalysing event might be a terrorist attack using aircraft. They actually said, quote, "A global terrorist group blows up an aircraft and announces it possesses portable nuclear weapons." They suggested this would trigger war and the onset of a security state. Or they actually said, "Congress declares war and authorises unlimited house-to-house searches." And they suggested this would generate conspiracy theories that the attack was an inside job. They said, "Opponents charge that the president concocted the emergency for political purposes." So, as I say, some people think Strauss and Howe were broadly correct about the mood of these times, the character of the young adult generation, and even some specific facts such as that the divorce rate would fall, which it has. On the other hand, some people see the whole theory as complete rubbish. A reviewer in the New York Times called it pseudoscience. He said, "The idea that history moves in cycles tends to be viewed with suspicion by scholars. Cyclical theories tend to end up in the Sargasso Sea of pseudoscience." But this is just a sweeping generalization. You know, cycle theories are wrong, and this is one. That's not really a useful critique. The reviewer also said, "Purveyors of pseudoscience typically try to validate their theories by brutally ransacking scholarship and mythology, which is sort of damning it by using deliberately emotive language. Brutally ransacking scholarship. Well, you could call it research, because Strauss and Howe didn't just make up their theory out of the blue. They show that a lot of people have in the past tackled the idea of generations and felt there was something there. And their ideas, for example, that there are 4 basic types of generation, are things that other people who have studied these things have arrived at. And Strauss and Howe didn't make up their theory just to annoy people. To accuse them of brutally ransacking scholarship is very uncharitable. They were trying to understand the changes in mood and behaviour that they felt characterised American history. And as the mists cleared through their research, the generations concept came into view. This reviewer also notes that in Strauss and Howe's book, quote, "You get sentences like this: an unravelling cannot lead back to an awakening or forward to a high without a crisis in between." Okay. He implies there's something wrong with that. But in Einstein's theory of relativity, you get sentences like this. If a law of nature is expressed by equating all the components of a tensor to zero, it is generally covariant. The fact the sentence doesn't make sense unless you know the technical terms doesn't prove the theory is wrong. The point Strauss and Howe were trying to make is that just as a bird cannot fly backwards, so society is subject to logical constraints that cause moods to transform in only one direction. Now, they might be wrong or right about that, but mocking the sentence itself proves nothing. Another criticism from the Critical Dictionary of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements implies that Strauss and Howe's theory is the sort of thing believed by people with undesirable political views. According to the article, it is a popular theory with political figures on the alt-right of America, such as Steve Bannon, the executive chair of Breitbart News. And it goes on to discuss Steve Bannon's use of the theory. Well, this is what is called an ad hominem attack, criticising the theory not for whether it matches the facts, but for the character of the people who believe in it. In any case, Al Gore was a big fan of Strauss and Howe's work, and he sent a copy of their book to every member of Congress. And as a Democrat vice president and climate campaigner, he is a very long way from being outright. And I find it ironic that the Critical Dictionary of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements completely fails to mention the biggest apocalyptic and millenarian movement of our times, which is the climate change movement. Another critic of Strauss and Howe's ideas is the theoretical historian Peter Turchin. He says it is just a prophecy, as Strauss and Howe themselves say, and not really a scientific theory. He says it simply postulates that there is a recurring cycle of 4 generation-length stages, and it is just because it is. He also says the theory is Procrustean, meaning it forces the facts into this preconceived cycle, rather than letting the cycle emerge naturally from the data. I think these criticisms are unfair. The fact is, Strauss and Howe don't just say the cycle is because it is. They do actually present a theoretical model to explain how such a cycle is likely to come about. It's in Appendix A of Generations, from page 440 to 448. And the theory isn't necessarily Procrustean. Strauss and Howe would say that they have gone through the history, through books and speeches and other historical materials, and observed the changing moods, letting the data speak. So their generations and turnings aren't of fixed length. They vary, and that's because Strauss and Howe let the data decide when one mood turns to another. And what's more, they find that in one case the data shows the cycle wasn't obeyed. That was with the American Civil War, which occurred early when the young adults were nomads, not heroes as would be expected. It effectively meant a very short crisis and a skipping of the generation sequence, which went straight from nomads to artists. Now, again, you may disagree with the detail of their arguments, but you can't accuse them of forcing the data to the cycle when they actually follow the data to recognise a glitch in the cycle. It shows their theory is not really about a rigid 4-stage cycle. It's really about social moods and their effects on the attitudes of cohort generations and the interaction between them, so that moods influence generations and generations then set social moods, which influence the next generations, and so on. The cycle itself can get disrupted by unusual events like the American Civil War, which Turchin himself sees as the product of another kind of cycle. But that fundamental interaction between moods and generations continues to operate. A final piece of criticism I will mention is this article, Against Generations, with the subtitle, Generational Thinking is Seductive and Confirms Preconceived Prejudices, but it's a bogus way to understand the world. Or, as the URL has it, generational labels are lazy, useless, and just plain wrong. So we can tell the author is not a fan. This is actually quite a good article. The author has done real research, engages with the substance of the theory, and makes good points. Okay, she starts off by saying that as a Generation Xer, she is supposed to be independent and entrepreneurial, and she kind of recognises herself in that. But her grandmother, who is from the GI generation, is selling books online at the age of 90, which seems exceedingly independent and entrepreneurial. So how meaningful really are these supposed generational distinctions? Okay, well, here's the thing. Personal anecdotes don't really prove anything one way or the other. As I've already mentioned, Strauss and Howe don't claim that people belonging to a generation are absolute clones of each other. We're talking about general tendencies. And another thing is that we don't know the true facts here. What does selling books online really mean? Did her grandmother go to the bank and get loan financing to set up a .com business selling books? Or has her grandmother always had a bookshop and just switched to selling through online portals like AbeBooks, like most other booksellers? Or has she decided to sell off her own personal books because she's moving into a retirement home with less space, and one of her grandchildren has helped her to list them on eBay? These are very different scenarios. Yes, by spinning words you can paint a particular picture, but it may give a deliberately misleading impression. Perhaps her grandmother really is an online entrepreneur, or perhaps she isn't. Again, this anecdote doesn't prove very much. I can accept that the author was just trying to make the article relatable and draw us in with this personal touch. That's fine, but it's not an argument against the Strauss and Howe theory. And I think it reveals an important point that is a problem for those who are trying to develop theories of history and society. It's that people tend to see things in personal terms, in terms of individual psychology. But we're not actually talking about that. We're not interested in people, we're interested in societies. Yes, societies are made of people, but animals are made of atoms. Thinking about individual psychology is no more relevant to the study of historical patterns than thinking about atomic physics is relevant to biology. These are different levels of analysis. So the Strauss-Howe theory is not talking about you. It's talking about your generation. It's not talking about your grandmother. It's talking about your grandmother's generation. It's the generation that plays the role of hero or prophet or whatever, not its individual members on a one-to-one basis. Collectively, emergently, the generation has a particular character, even though some individuals of that generation, perhaps most of them, will not be absolutely typical of it in themselves. Getting back to this article, the author does a good job of getting to grips with several generations theorists, not just Strauss and Howe. And what's interesting is that despite the flat rejection implied by her title, she actually cedes quite a lot. She mentions the book Inheriting the Revolution by Joyce Appleby, about the generation that came of age after 1790, the first full Americans, and she seems to approve of it, saying, quote, "Some historians have tried to think generationally while rigorously acknowledging the structural limitations of the approach." So she thinks there can be good uses of the concept, and it's just the Strauss-Howe theory that she finds too simplistic. She kind of reveals what really bothers her about the theory when she says it is used to demean the young adult generation, saying that they're kind of arrogant and expect things on a plate. Well, yes, but they are also called a hero generation. Heroes, is this really demeaning them? But this could be considered part of the whole syndrome. Strauss and Howe point out how the nomad Generation Xers were routinely disparaged and criticised when they were young, and no one cared in those days. But a hero generation is treated more protectively, and there is perhaps a feeling that any kind of criticism is out of order. She says that presenting the millennials as lacking the application and economic self-sufficiency of Generation X is unfair because the children of the 1970s enjoyed low tuition fees and were able to walk into jobs when they graduated, whereas the millennials are loaded with massive student debt and the work isn't there for them. Well, yes, that's true, but isn't this precisely what Strauss-Howe are saying? The millennials were born into an unravelling, a time of growing selfishness, emphasising individualism and self-reliance, not society's obligations to its population. Arthur Schlesinger, one of the theorists that Strauss-Howe draw upon, talks in terms of what he sees as an oscillation between public purpose and private interest phases in American history. And the Generation Xers were born into a phase of public purpose when governments were expanding, whereas millennials were born into a phase of private interest when governments were downsizing, with Reaganomics and Thatcherism, which emphasised cutting taxes and spending and putting responsibility on individuals, so society was investing less and less proportionately in its youth. Now, I'm simplifying because there are other issues such as the large number of baby boomers making society top-heavy, absorbing money for retirement and social care, leaving less for the young, and also the massive expansion of university education, making it relatively more expensive for society and leaving less for each student. But these are kind of the upfront reasons for why things changed. And behind them are questions like, why were the boomers more numerous? And why did university attendance become much more common? And these all relate back to the fundamental issue, which is the move from high to awakening to unravelling and eventually crisis. If there aren't the jobs, or at least the suitable kind of work for millennials to move into, this is again exactly in keeping with the theory. The unravelling was a more entrepreneurial time, so the economy was more vigorous and vital, creating more jobs and opportunities. This is exactly what Strauss-Howe are saying. Those jobs the Generation Xers got didn't come from nowhere as if by magic. They were created by the mood and behaviours of that time. And the millennials, on the other hand, have come of age in a crisis, as hero generations always do, when the economy is more difficult and politics is more divisive, just like the last hero generation came of age in the Great Depression, then got hit by a world war. So far from disproving the Strauss-Howe theory, what she's saying is really consistent with it, and even confirms it. The problem is that one of seeing it in psychological, not sociological terms, of taking it personally, as though the description of the millennial generation is a commentary on them as individuals, as though it is a kind of character assassination, when it's really only describing how the changing social mood and social circumstances affect the behaviour of those who happen to be young at that time. Don't take it personally. It's not about you. It's about generations. So, I think this article is right to say social affairs are more complex than just labelling whole generations as this or that. But it doesn't convince me that the basic idea has to be abandoned, especially when the author even uses the idea that different generations have different experiences and outlooks on life. You see, the idea that there should be a cycle of generations actually makes a lot of sense. And you could say that it would be more surprising if there wasn't such a cycle. This is because of something Aristotle said, which is that no set of societal arrangements is perfect. And so there is bound to be an oscillation as people swing from one way of doing things to another and back again. So when young people are growing up, they'll get to observe the world in which they live, and they can see all the things that are wrong with it. And it's kind of natural that when they get old enough and get into positions of power, they're going to want to correct those faults. So they're going to take society in a different direction. But their new version of society is going to have problems of its own. By solving one set of problems, the new generation introduces another set of problems. And so the generation coming up behind them will repeat the process, see the problems and try to correct them. And in doing so, will introduce yet another set of problems. And given that there's only a limited number of arrangements that are actually possible for society, things are eventually going to return to the starting point and the cycle will begin again. So the problem with the Strauss-Howe theory is not the concept itself, it's more a question of presentation. And the author of this article makes a good point when she says that Strauss and Howe's descriptions of the different generation types come across as being like astrological horoscopes. For example, we're told that artists are corporate and technically minded with a capacity for complex collective projects, that they have a liking for elite culture, and that they remain young at heart into old age. It does sound very like saying that people with, say, the Taurus star sign are dedicated and dependable, value honesty, and have a capacity for hard work and do like their creature comforts. It's sufficiently broad and sufficiently flattering that people can see themselves in that description if they're told it applies to them. You know, you sort of pick up on the bits that seem to match and ignore the bits that don't fit because, well, everyone's going to have a few idiosyncrasies, aren't they? And this is what makes the theory seem pseudoscientific. It looks as though if you want to believe in it enough, you can always interpret it in a way that sort of makes it work. It's similar with the turnings. We're supposed to be in a crisis, and yes, it began with September the 11th, and there was the financial crisis of 2008, and we've now had the coronavirus pandemic, and there does seem to be a lot of political stress and polarisation with Brexit in the UK and the Trump presidency and everything associated with that. So you could say it seems to fit the theory. But then in 1987 there was a big stock market crash, and in the 1970s there were the oil shocks and high inflation, and even in the supposed high, people were living under the threat of nuclear war, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And talking about political crisis, there was the actual assassination of a president, JFK, and then of his brother, a presidential candidate, and also of Martin Luther King. And in the 1970s, you had the Watergate scandal and President Nixon was forced to resign. So, you know, when was there not a crisis, really? It does look as though if you cherry pick the facts you want to focus on, you can make any era look like a crisis or an unravelling or whatever is needed to fit the theory. So this again makes it seem pseudoscientific. The basic problem is that the theory is presented in a verbal and anecdotal way. When you're talking about a social mood or the character of a generation, it does seem pretty subjective. How can we tell whether a generation is of the artist type? It seems that it is only by a sort of subjective assessment of how well its members fit the description. And as we've seen, it seems as though you could persuade yourself either way, depending on what you wanted to believe. So what we need is to make the theory more objective, more quantifiable. We need to be able to measure the character of a generation. We need to be able to say how artist it is or how hero it is. And with some more objective definitions, we should be able to say why there is a generational cycle in the first place. So how can we do that? Well, Peter Turchin, who I mentioned earlier as a critic, has his own theory of a generational cycle, which he calls father-son cycles. The idea behind this is that a generation that has grown up in times of war and conflict tends to be peace-loving when it gets older. It has seen the bad side of disorder and violence, and so it prefers to be easygoing and tries to prevent social relationships breaking down when it is old enough to be in charge of society. On the other hand, a generation that has grown up in peaceful times is not inoculated against violence in that way. it is less cautious about avoiding violence and is more likely to get into confrontation and let hostilities break out. So this leads to an alternation between conflict-prone and conflict-averse generations. If the fathers are conflict-prone, their sons are conflict-averse, and if the fathers are conflict-averse, the sons are conflict-prone. Peter Turchin measures this not by studying the character of the generations directly, but by measuring the amount of conflict in society. He has done this for ancient Rome and medieval France, and found that you get a pretty regular 50-year cycle, implying a 2-generation oscillation if a generation lasts roughly 25 years. First, you get a fairly peaceful period while a conflict-averse generation is in power. Then you get a period with lots of rebellions and civil wars when their conflict-prone sons come to power. Then the conflict-averse grandsons come to power, bringing peace again, and the cycle repeats. So this seems to be one way in which generations can vary, conflict-prone versus conflict-averse. And we can measure it by counting the amount of conflict in society when that generation is in its prime. So we're starting to be able to be somewhat objective about the character of a generation and be able to measure it. Now let's compare this with the Strauss-Howe theory. They don't have an alternation of 2 generations types, they have 4 generations. But if we put up the cycle, we can see that there is a similarity to the father-son theory. So first we have the high, and that's a time of optimism and positive social mood, so that's a relatively peaceful time. Then we have the awakening, and that's a time when cultural values are under attack and being changed. Strauss and Howe call this an interior crisis. It's a time when the inner nature of society is being contested and transformed, when values, ideology and belief are being challenged. There is a crisis in the inner world of thought and meaning. So there is a lot of conflict, and it's cultural conflict. Then we move on to the unravelling. Now, although things are slowly falling apart, this is also a relatively peaceful time. People are getting on with the business of earning a living. And as Dr. Johnson is supposed to have said, there are few ways in which a man can be more innocently employed than in getting money. There's no great confrontation. Finally, we move on to the crisis. And this is, of course, a crisis, and it's one that affects politics and economics, which Strauss and Howe call an exterior crisis. It affects the outer nature of society, its political and economic structures, its institutions, its behaviours. So again, this is a time of turmoil and change. So in the Strauss and Howe theory, there are 2 crisis periods, the interior and exterior crises, which are times of struggle. Firstly, cultural struggle, then politico-economic struggle. And 2 non-crisis periods, one a peaceful, optimistic time when things are getting better, and the other a peaceful, pessimistic time when things are getting worse. So if we put 2 father-son cycles side by side, we see it's basically the same thing. The only difference is that Strauss and Howe have 2 kinds of crisis, where the father-son theory only has one kind. What Strauss and Howe might say is that the father-son theory misses an important distinction, and just counting the amount of conflict isn't enough. You also need to take account of the type of conflict and what it's about, whether it's about cultural values or whether it's about political and economic affairs. And Strauss and Howe aren't the only ones to notice this distinction, at least in American society. Samuel Huntington, a professor of political science who's probably most famous for his book The Clash of Civilizations, similarly noticed an alternation between episodes involving the discovery of new ideals, like a Strauss-Howe awakening, and episodes involving the building of new institutions, like a Strauss-Howe crisis phase, with quieter generations in between. Now, going round this cycle, we can say that the crisis is the era of maximum disorder, where I'm using order to refer to the exterior properties of society, meaning economic and political institutions. So in the crisis, economic and political institutions are really failing. The economy is falling apart, political life is fractured and polarised. This is disorder. And what the crisis does eventually is turn that around. The crumbling of order is slowed down and brought to a halt as the generations of that time overcome the crisis and start to rebuild society with new institutions. So as society goes into the high, order is returning, and by the time you reach the awakening, order is reaching a maximum and eventually peaks. In the unravelling, order starts to fall again at an accelerating rate, leading to a new crisis. So this rise and fall of order is one basic dynamic of the cycle. But order isn't the only thing that varies. And to understand that, we need to look in more detail at Strauss-Howe's description of the different cycle phases. And so here we have high, awakening, unravelling, and crisis, and what Strauss-Howe have to say about various aspects of social life in each phase. So let's start with what they call social priority. And we can see that in the high, we have maximum community. So this is when the society feels most cohesive and bonded, focused around shared values and shared interests, everybody being part of one happy community, all on the same side. But in the awakening, individualism is beginning to increase. Some people are beginning to say, well, actually, we reject those values. We don't really want to fit in with everyone else. We think society should be going in a different direction. So people are kind of shrugging off what might be called the small town mentality, where everyone knows everyone else and conformity is crucial. And instead, they're going their own way, seeking individual freedom. And this trend continues into the unravelling, where individualism reaches a maximum. So this is when people are focused on making their own private fortunes, not on solving the problems of the world. It's the time of maximum selfishness, of no such thing as society. And then we move into the crisis. And now community is rising again. So this is when the world does have problems and people are focused on solving them. And it's the time when you have that teamship of the hero generation, and society is pulling together to overcome economic hardship, as with Roosevelt's New Deal, or to fight a war. So we can draw another chart for this concept of community. As we've seen, it rises to a peak in the high, then it starts to fall in the awakening, reaches rock bottom in the unravelling, and begins to rise again during the crisis. And if we look at other parts of Strauss-Howe's table, we find this same basic story of community rising and peaking during the crisis and high, and falling to its low point through the awakening and unravelling. So in the crisis and high, families are strengthening and strong, institutions are founded and reinforced, and social structure is gravitating and unified, all things that suggest a strong community. Similarly, ideals are championed and settled, culture is practical and innocent, and the worldview becomes simple, again suggesting a society that is pulling together and sticking together. Even the behaviour of gender roles suggests this. The gender role gap becomes wider and is at a maximum during the crisis and high, and it tends to be strong communities that impose more rigid social roles on people, while in weaker communities anything goes and people are freer to be themselves. So if we look at the awakening and unravelling, we find the opposite of all these trends, and there is a decline of community and societal bonds. Families are weakening and weak, institutions are attacked and eroded, social structure is splintering and diversified, ideals are discovered and debated, culture is passionate and cynical, the worldview becomes complex, and the gender role gap narrows. So putting the two charts together, we have this. We've managed to characterise the Strauss-Howe cycle in terms of two basic dimensions, order and community. The high is when order and community are both increasing. The awakening is when order is increasing and community is decreasing, though both are on the high side. The unravelling is when order and community are both decreasing, and the crisis is when order is decreasing while community is increasing, though both are on the low side. So we can start to see how these two dimensions tend to define the four different types of era, each with its own distinctive feel. With the father-son theory, we just have one dimension, order, which comes and goes. So the Strauss-Howe theory is again saying, well, actually things are a bit more complicated. Yes, society is held together by its outer institutions, its outer relationships consisting of economic and political interactions, and these can indeed go from order to disorder and back. But society is also held together by its inner relationships, by what people think and feel, by the extent to which they share their values and see themselves as having common interests. This is the sense of community, which is different from order and just as important. So you could say that the father-son theory is a one-dimensional theory, while the Strauss-Howe theory is a two-dimensional theory. And although order and community are different dimensions, they are closely related. We can say that it's the breakdown of community that leads to the breakdown of order. When people no longer feel that they have the same interests and that they share the same values, political conflict and economic stress become more likely. The result is a breakdown of order. And that rekindles people's desire to try and get along with each other, i.e. to rebuild a sense of community. And a stronger community results in the restoration of order. And then finally, it's because an orderly society gives people a kind of feeling of security that they feel comfortable about questioning society's values. But this is what causes the sense of community to weaken, and so the cycle repeats. So the cycle is driven by less community, less order, more community, more order, and more order, less community. We can represent this by what is known in physics as a simple harmonic oscillator. So I'm going to get a bit technical for a minute for those of a mathematical inclination. If you're not that mathematical, don't worry, because you can get the basic point from the pictures. So the first thing to notice is that order changes in the same direction as community. So more community produces more order. So we can write in symbols the rate of change of order, dO by dt, is proportional to the amount of community, C. On the other hand, community changes in the opposite direction to order. More order causes community to decrease, and less order causes community to increase. So we can write in symbols that the rate of change of community, dC by dt, is proportional to the negative of the amount of order. If order is positive, community decreases, and if order is negative, i.e. if there is disorder, community increases. Now, these equations can be solved by standard mathematical techniques to give that C and O, community and order, vary like this. In technical terms, order is a sine wave while community is a cosine wave. So we can see that as order goes negative, community starts to increase. And once community becomes positive, order starts to increase. And with order becoming positive, community starts to decrease. And then as community becomes negative, order starts to decrease again. And so the cycle repeats. And if we compare this with what we worked out before, just by thinking about what Strauss and Howe found about the variation of order and community throughout the cycle, we can see it's basically the same thing. So now we know why order and community oscillate in this way throughout the cycle. It's because community builds up order and order allows community to decay. Now let's add up community and order and call that the well-being of society, which depends on both community and order. we're saying that to some extent community can compensate for a lack of order and vice versa. So we're interested in the total of community plus order. If we do that, we get this chart. So notice that during the crisis, total well-being is constantly negative. At the start, community is negative and order is neutral, giving overall negative well-being. And as community increases, order decreases, so well-being remains the same. Then as we go into the high, with both order and community increasing, overall well-being increases rapidly from maximum negative to maximum positive. Then in the awakening, increasing order compensates for decreasing community, so well-being remains constantly positive. And finally, in the unravelling, both order and community are decreasing, and well-being decreases rapidly from maximum positive to maximum negative. So here we have it. The crisis is a time of constantly negative well-being. The high is a time of quickly rising well-being. The awakening is a time of constantly positive well-being. And the unravelling is a time of quickly falling well-being. This is all what we would expect. Now let's label this diagram with the generation types that are children during each phase. So artists are children during a crisis, prophets during a high, nomads during an awakening, and heroes during an unravelling. And let's compare that with what Strauss and Howe say about the degree of protection for children of each type of generation. So it's in this table again. We have crisis, overprotected, high, loosening, awakening, underprotected, and unravelling, tightening. What Strauss and Howe are talking about here is that the children of the war years, say, the artist generation, were kept at home and sheltered from the turmoil of the adult world. They were overprotected. Whereas the nomads who were born in the more benign 60s and 70s were left to their own devices. They were underprotected. People who were children in that time will talk about the tremendous freedom they had as children, playing out with their friends late into the evening, roaming far and wide on their bicycles. Newspapers at the time talked of latchkey kids who came home from school and let themselves in, making their own tea while their parents were still at work. Strauss and Howe mention how childcare experts of the time said that children should not be mollycoddled, and they point out how it was in the 1980s and 1990s, when the hero generation was born, that you started getting signs of protection like baby on board stickers and car seats and cycle helmets, none of which had existed for the nomad children. So let's put that on a chart. We have overprotected, loosening, underprotected, and tightening. Well, we can see that it's just an inversion of the well-being chart. So that seems to explain why child nurture varies in this way. During times of low societal well-being, parents feel the need to protect their children, to insulate them from the disorder and disunity in the world at large. And during times of high societal well-being, parents feel little need to protect their children, and they are happy to give them a looser rein. Society is orderly and there's a good sense of community, so parents feel their children are safe. And in the intermediate periods, when well-being is either rising or falling, parents' urge to protect their children decreases or increases accordingly. So this fills in another piece of the puzzle. And we can see how these two dimensions, order and community, and the way they interact, create the cycle of social mood. And that has effects on things like the strength of institutions, the gender role gap, and the way children are raised. We can also see how people will have very different experiences depending on where in the cycle they are born, which is likely to give them different outlooks on life. And because the cycle tends to divide into these 4 different phases, we can expect 4 basic generation types: one for each phase. But what about the character of the generations? Well, here we can begin with a clue from something said by Strauss-Howe, which is that the mood of society in terms of calm or crisis, in terms of its propensity for turmoil, conflict and disorder, is determined by the young adults. We can understand this because it's young people who are most likely to get involved in rebellion and revolution. As people get older, they acquire careers and mortgages and families, and they're generally more invested in the status quo. They've got their lives together and they don't want everything turned upside down. And in any case, they've been part of the adult world for a couple of decades or more. So the status quo is what they themselves have produced. It's the world they have built, and it reflects their goals and values. But young people don't have any of that investment and baggage. They don't have much in the way of savings and property or valued social positions. So they have more to gain than to lose if the existing order of things is overthrown. And they're probably also more resilient and adaptable, so they can cope better with rapid change. So, to repeat, if there's going to be conflict and disorder in society, it's going to come mainly from the young adults. So let's look at the different turnings and the children and young adults in each case. Here we have crisis, high, awakening and unravelling. And let's look at the young adults first. So in a crisis we have heroes. So they are a generation that is connected with conflict and disruption. And in an awakening, the time of the cultural crisis, we have prophets. So they're also a generation that is connected with conflict and disruption. And in the two non-crisis eras, we have the artists in the high and the nomads in the unravelling. And so these are generations that are not connected with conflict and disruption. So using the same terms as father-son theory, we can call the heroes and prophets conflict-prone generations, which I'll colour red, and the artists and nomads conflict-averse generations, which I'll colour blue. So we have an alternation of conflict-prone and conflict-averse generations. And now let's fill in the child age bracket. We have artists who are conflict-averse, prophets conflict-prone, nomads conflict-averse, and heroes conflict-prone. So we can see we have the same pattern as father-son theory, and it's also what Aristotle says. The artists and nomads who grow up during the time of a conflict-prone generation become conflict-averse, and the prophets and heroes who grow up during the time of a conflict-averse generation become conflict-prone. Each generation type ends up reacting against the type of social mood it experiences as it is growing up. Now, I tend to use the terms radical and moderate. So heroes and prophets are radical generations, and artists and nomads are moderate generations. And so this is one dimension on which the generation types vary, which I will call compliance. Artists and nomads have high compliance. They tend to fit in with the way of the world. They don't rock the boat. They quietly get on with things. But heroes and prophets are the opposite. They have low compliance. They don't fit in with the world, but try to change it. They don't shy away from conflict and confrontation. So we get this radical moderate swing in social mood, switching every generation. And it's because a radical generation produces conflict, and conflict produces a moderate generation. And vice versa. Moderates produce peace, which makes the next generation more radical. But as we've seen, peace and conflict are just one dimension of the Strauss-Howe theory. And there's also the question of whether conflict breaks down the sense of community, as in the interior crisis, or builds up the sense of community, as in the exterior crisis. So we should expect there to be some other characteristic of generations affecting this oscillation in community. So let's have a look back at our generations. We know for prophets, they're individualists. They think independently. They come up with new value systems. They don't follow value systems that are already there. And this individualism is what starts the erosion of the sense of community. And we've seen that the nomads who follow them are also individualists focusing on their private self-interest. They're into private enterprise, not public enterprise. But then the heroes are team workers, the very opposite of individualists. They work well together, and that is their preferred way of working. They're quite conformist, going with the pack. So we can call them collectivist, the opposite of individualist. And then the artists are similar. They're described as having a corporate mentality and being good at working together on large complex tasks. So they're also collectivist rather than individualist. Okay, so if we just put up the 4 generation types, and this time use red for individualist and blue for collectivist, we have heroes and artists blue, prophets and nomads red. And by collectivist, we are referring to generations that tend to build up community, and by individualist, we are referring to generations that tend to break community down. Now, in the case of peace, we said it depends just on the young adults. So we only needed to consider the young adult generation to decide how the children would turn out. But what about community? Well, the sense of community depends on the strength of social relationships in society. And those are built up by things like clubs and associations, voluntary organisations, churches and other faiths, cultural events, government programmes and institutions, the military, families, of course. And these are things in which people of all ages are involved. It's not just the young adults. Mature middle-aged adults and older retired people are just as important. So to decide what children experience in the area of community, we're going to have to consider all 3 adult age brackets: youth, midlife and elder. So let's put that up. Again, start with the crisis, and we have collectivist heroes as young adults, individualist nomads in midlife, and individualist prophets as elders. So in this case, the individualists win. There's more individualism in society than collectivism, and the sense of community is weak. Aristotle's principle tells us that the child generation, the artists, are going to react against that. They see all the individualism in society and the crisis it's causing, and they grow up with a preference to be collectivist. And now we move on to the high, and everyone's moved up one with a new prophet generation appearing at the bottom. And now the collectivists outnumber the individualists. So we have that strong sense of community that is typical for a high. And what's the result? Well, the prophets are going to see all the collectivism and how it creates groupthink, say, and how it can be constricting, making people conform to more rigid social roles, and they're going to swing the other way and become individualist. Next, we have the awakening, one generation on again. The individualist prophets have replaced the individualist nomads who have died off, but the artists and heroes are still around, so collectivism still outnumbers individualism. So the child generation, a new nomad generation, are going to react against all that collectivism, and they're going to turn out individualist. Finally, we move on to the unravelling, and the nomads are now the young adults, the prophets are above them, and the artists are the elders. Well, now it's 2 against 1 in favour of individualism, and so by the now familiar Aristotle's principle, the children are going to swing towards collectivism. So you can see how this cycle of individualism and collectivism reproduces itself. Again, we have an oscillation, but now the cycle takes longer to work through because it's all 3 adult generations that are involved, not just one. Instead of switching every generation, like with compliance, we get 2 individualist generations, then 2 collectivist generations, and then back to 2 individualist, and so on. And this issue of individualism and collectivism is the second dimension on which the different generations vary. I call it sociability. So the collectivist heroes and artists have high sociability with their teamship and corporate values, and the individualist prophets and nomads have low sociability with their independent thinking and private entrepreneurship. And what we've seen is that the pattern of sociability, two individualist then two collectivist, reproduces itself for two basic reasons: the fact that three adult generations are involved and the operation of Aristotle's principle. So let's put these two things together and look at the generations in terms of both compliance and sociability. Let's take the configuration of generations that you have in a crisis, with artists at the bottom going up to prophets at the top. So filling in compliance, we have moderate, radical, moderate, radical. And filling in sociability, we have collectivist, collectivist, individualist, individualist. I make the child generation paler because their characteristics don't really exist yet. They are just being formed by the characteristics of the generations above them. And let's also fill in the social mood. So with a radical generation in the young adult slot, this is a time of conflict or lack of peace, which I'll put as red. And with two individualist to one collectivist generation, this is also a time of low community or disunity, which I'll again put as red. Now we can do the same for the other turnings. So I'll fill in the configurations of the generations. Their respective characteristics don't change, they just occupy different positions in the age hierarchy. And similarly, we can fill in the social mood. So for the high, a moderate generation as young adults, so a time of peace. And collectivism dominant, so a time of community. So blue for peace and blue for community. Then the awakening, we get red for conflict from the young adult prophets, with blue for community from collectivism being dominant. And for the unravelling, we get blue for peace from the young adult nomads and red for disunity from dominant individualism. So with this picture, we can sum up the Strauss-Howe theory and explain why it works. Generations vary along two dimensions, and social mood varies on two dimensions, with a direct link between them. The characteristics of the adult generations determine the social mood, and the mood determines the characteristics of the child generation coming up. And we get this particular pattern of generations because of the way peace depends on just the young adults, while community depends on all adults, and because of Aristotle's principle, which is also used in father-son theory, that people react against their early formative experiences. And one thing we notice from this diagram is that social time is in a sense two-dimensional. There is horizontal time, which is the normal calendar time, and there's also vertical time, which is age. So if you are, say, this artist generation beginning in childhood during the crisis, you experience time in two different ways. You move along in calendar time and you move up in age. And the two are obviously closely related because we age 1 year for every year of calendar time. But it's important to recognise them both because people are shaped by their experiences, and if there are cycles in social mood, then we will get cycles in generational attitudes and vice versa. Social cycles and generational cycles are completely intertwined. So in this picture, we have a cycle in calendar time from disorder, disunity to order, community and back. And we have a cycle in age from moderate collectivism to radical individualism and back. And the two cycles produce each other. And because of what I talked about earlier concerning the simple harmonic oscillator involving order and community, we know that order and community are always lined up in a particular way. And it means that compliance and sociability, which directly relate to order and community, are also lined up in the same way. It's that simple harmonic oscillator interaction that means the cycles of compliance and sociability keep in sync, and we tend to get a predictable succession of artist, prophet, nomad, hero. Now this picture is an idealization, and so is the Strauss-Howe theory. It's an idealization. It's a tendency towards a pattern in human affairs, and it arises from the simple basic principles I've been talking about, like the fact that people's attitudes can vary along moderate, radical and collectivist individualist dimensions. and that they tend to swing towards the opposite of what they see when they are growing up. To the extent that those principles apply, there will be this tendency. And yes, it can be disrupted by other factors, as Strauss-Howe found in the case of the American Civil War. But it's quite a strong tendency. And in the case of the American Civil War, the cycle soon reasserted itself. Strauss-Howe suggests that a key factor keeping the cycle on track is the exterior crisis, which is usually a war or revolution and highly traumatic. It has a powerful effect on the people living at that time, especially the children, and it's strong enough to create a fairly uniform reaction, overriding individual differences in people's underlying personalities and their life circumstances, whether rich or poor, for example. The exterior crisis is like a kick that re-energizes the cycle. It can occur offbeat, as in the case of the American Civil War that came early during an unravelling, but it's most likely to occur in the crisis, which is when all the signals are on red. So in that way, the exterior crisis helps maintain a regular rhythm to the cycle. This is in addition to everything else I've talked about, the interaction of peace, community, compliance and sociability, which also channel the cycle into a particular pattern once it has got going. So yes, we can expect this tendency of a generational cycle to show up in social affairs. It may be stronger at some times than others, and some generations may be more distinctive, others less so, but there's always this background logic influencing generational attitudes and social mood. It may be that when it's been a while since the kick of the exterior crisis, the cycle becomes weaker, and perhaps that's the case as we come up to 80 years past the end of the last such crisis. It may be that the differences between generations are becoming a bit smeared out and not completely true to form. It may be, though I'm not convinced that is the case, and I think things are arguably unfolding still quite close to the Strauss-Howe pattern. Now, this picture, as well as an idealization, is also a simplification, because a given generation doesn't stay as children for 20 years, then suddenly all jump into young adulthood. What these diagrams show is a snapshot of the situation at the end of each turning. And between the snapshots, the generations are sliding from one age bracket to another. Now, this complicates things because it means that most of the time, a given age bracket is shared between two generations, one moving in and the other moving out. So when I say that these artists, say, experience a radical hero generation in the young adult age bracket, that's not really true, because for the time leading up to this snapshot, some of the young adults were moderate nomads, and after this snapshot, when the youngest artists are still children, some of the young adults are themselves artists who are moderate. Now, it turns out that this doesn't matter if we say that it's the average experience that's important. For a given artist growing up, the young adult age bracket is always a mixture of heroes and something else, except for this one moment at the end of the fourth turning. But nevertheless, for a typical artist childhood, it's always the heroes that dominate the young adult age bracket. So they mostly experience hero characteristics in that age bracket, i.e. radicalism. And we can say that this experience of more radicalism than moderatism is enough to turn the artists towards moderatism. So to see this, firstly think about how the amount of radicalism in the young adult bracket varies over the cycle. So let's start at the end of a third turning. At this moment, the young adults are all nomads. So we're at full moderatism, and we'll call that maximum positive compliance. So we start with maximum positive compliance. Now, as we move into the fourth turning, the first heroes start to come of age and become young adults, while the oldest nomads are moving on to midlife. So we're losing nomads and gaining heroes. So there are fewer moderates and more radicals, which means the young adults are becoming increasingly radical, or in other words, compliance is falling. And once we're halfway through the fourth turning, we've got an equal mix of heroes and nomads, which cancel out. So we can say compliance is zero, neither positive nor negative. And now, as we continue through the second half of the fourth turning, heroes continue to move into the young adult bracket and compliance continues to fall until by the end of the turning, all young adults are radical heroes. So we are at maximum radicalism, which we can call maximum negative compliance. And now things continue into the first turning, and the oldest heroes are starting to move on into midlife, while the oldest artists are becoming young adults. So the young adults are losing radical heroes and gaining moderate artists, and the amount of radicalism in the age bracket is decreasing, or in other words, compliance is increasing again. By halfway through the first turning, we are back to zero net compliance, with an equal mix of moderates and radicals. And by the end of the turning, we have all young adults being artists, taking us back to maximum moderatism and full positive compliance. So the variation of compliance looks like this. Now think about what a typical artist experiences. An artist is someone who is born in the fourth turning. So it's someone whose childhood begins somewhere on this downsloping part of the line. And their childhood lasts a generation, one turning in total. So let's take someone who is born here, say. The thick part of the line shows the time when they are a child, and we can see that it spends more time in the negative compliance region than in the positive. More of the line is red than it is blue. So the overall experience of their childhood is red, negative, and this tends to make them blue, positive. And if we look at anyone born during this fourth turning, most of their childhood will be in the negative, except for people born right at the ends on the cusp between the generations, and they will experience an equal mix of positive and negative, giving overall zero. So yes, there are going to be some people who are exactly between two generation types, and it's a bit of a toss-up which way they fall. But there aren't going to be many of them, and the people who are born actually within the fourth turning, not at either end, will experience overall negative compliance, and by Aristotle's principle, veer towards positive compliance in their own attitudes. You can check this for compliance of the other generation types, and also for the case of sociability, and you will find that in all cases the same thing applies. While it's not true that a generation experiences only a particular kind of compliance or sociability when it's growing up, it does experience that kind of compliance or sociability overall. So with that caveat, all the arguments I gave earlier still apply. Another issue is that by describing the generations in terms of compliance and sociability, I've not necessarily covered all aspects of their differing characteristics. For example, artists are supposed to like elite culture and to remain young at heart into their old age. Neither of these seems to follow particularly from the fact that they are moderate and collectivist. I think in this case part of the explanation may derive from their degree of protectiveness as children. This would be saying something like their highly supervised childhoods introduced them to things like classical music, whereas nomads, who are left unsupervised to climb trees and play with their friends until it grows dark, never develop those tastes. And similarly, because artists have such suffocated childhoods, perhaps they retain a childlike energy or a thirst for exploring new experiences into late life. By contrast, underprotected nomads grow up tough and are more wizened than childlike in their old age. So there seem to be a range of other issues distinguishing the generations, which may be linked to the chart of order and protectiveness. I haven't investigated this closely, and it's not really necessary for the points I want to make here. It's an extension that could be considered in future, though. And on a related note, this version of the Strauss-Howe theory makes the assumption that people's attitudes are mostly formed during their childhood and youth, up to the age of about 20 or 22, before they pass into young adulthood. I believe that's true. Nevertheless, it needs to be recognised as one of the theory's assumptions, so that in future one could think about what happens if it's not true or not entirely true. and so develop a more sophisticated version of the theory. For example, it could be that people's attitudes become steadily less susceptible to change rather than there being a sharp cutoff. And that could still result in a cycle, but one where the generations blend into each other a bit more at the edges. And there is, by the way, a whole field of theoretical history called psychohistory, which is concerned with the way that childhood experiences shape adult attitudes and thereby influence the behaviour of societies and nation states. Anyway, what we've done here is turn the descriptions of the Strauss-Howe generations from the astrological horoscope kind of presentation into two explicit dimensions that we can talk about more objectively and hopefully measure. So instead of asking whether a group of people fits the description of a hero generation or whatever, we can measure their compliance and sociability and say, for example, low compliance, high sociability, these are heroes. At least we can do that if we have a way of measuring these quantities and if we have the data that is required. And in that respect, this is early days. Both how to measure and where to get data are in need of investigation. But I have done some work on this, particularly in the case of Russia, which Strauss and Howe didn't investigate. And the results are encouraging. In Russia, at least, there do seem to be cycles in compliance and sociability, matching the Strauss-Howe theory. To measure compliance, I followed up an idea suggested by Peter Turchin, which is that the level of radicalism in society can be measured by the degree of trust in public institutions. The more radical people are, the less they trust the government, the legal system, and things like that. So this chart shows the results of an opinion poll done in Russia in 2015, which included a question about whether people felt the Duma, the Russian parliament, could be trusted. And I've grouped the people's answers into three brackets according to their age, which fortunately was recorded in the survey results. So we have young adults, midlifers, and elders. And we can see that midlifers tend to be less trusting, i.e. more radical. So it looks as though we have a moderate generation, a radical generation, and a moderate generation, just the kind of alternation the Strauss-Howe theory would predict. And if you do a chi-squared test, a kind of statistical test on this, it shows that the result is statistically significant. It is very unlikely that this pattern could have occurred by chance, and we can be about 99% confident that this moderate radical moderate variation is a real phenomenon. Now, moderate radical moderate could occur in two ways, either artist hero nomad or nomad prophet artist. To decide between the two possibilities, we need to measure collectivism. And fortunately, back in 2016, some researchers did just that. Their paper is called Temporal Relationships Between Individualism, Collectivism and the Economy in Soviet Russia. And to research it, they had to find a way of measuring individualism versus collectivism. The method they used involved Google Ngrams, which is a free service allowing you to check the frequency of words and phrases in the books that Google has scanned going back to the year 1800. So in Google's default example, they show the changing frequency of the terms Albert Einstein, Sherlock Holmes, and Frankenstein. And you can see that Sherlock Holmes is gaining on Frankenstein in terms of the frequency of being mentioned in books and journals, while Einstein has recently taken a dip in popularity. And Google has a Russian version of this. And what these researchers did was come up with a list of collectivist words and phrases like family, team, and brotherhood, and look at how they varied in popularity going back to 1900. And the idea was that times when a lot of collectivist language was being used were times when society was itself more collectivist. So this would be a way to measure the amount of collectivism. And here's an example with the word semya, which is the Russian for family. Now we need to think about how we expect sociability to vary over the cycle. So let's go back to this diagram and start at the end of the crisis, i.e. as we are about to go into the first turning. We're focusing on sociability, which depends on all three adult generations. And here, at the end of the crisis, we have two individualist generations, prophet and nomad, and one collectivist generation, hero. So it's 2 against 1 in favour of individualism. And that's really the maximum individualism you can have. So we start with maximum individualism, or in other words, maximum negative sociability. And as we move into the high, individualist prophets are dying off, while collectivist artists are coming of age. So we're getting more collectivism and less individualism. And by the end of the high, it's 2 to 1 in favour of collectivism. So we're at maximum positive sociability. Next, we move into the awakening. And now, although individualist prophets are coming of age, the individualist nomads are dying off. So overall sociability isn't changing. It's still 2 to 1 for collectivists. Next, we move into the unravelling. And now a new generation of nomads is coming of age, while heroes are dying off. So more individualists, fewer collectivists, and sociability heads back to the minimum. And lastly, as we move into the next crisis, the fourth turning, heroes are coming on, but artists are dying off, so sociability remains at a minimum. So if the Strauss-Howe cycle is correct, the variation of sociability should look like this: rising for a generation, i.e. about 20 years, steady for a generation, falling for a generation, and again steady for a generation. Then repeat. And in fact, just with this word siamya, family, which we're suggesting was more common during collectivist times when families were more important, we can sort of see this pattern. It has been a fairly constant high for the last 20 years. Then going backwards, it's falling for 20 years, then kind of steadily low for 20 years, then kind of rising again for 20 years, and then kind of at a constant high again for 20 years. And although there is this dip here, on average this 20 years was relatively high compared to this 20 years. So bearing in mind that this is a rough example just to show the idea, we do seem to get a hint of that Strauss-Howe pattern. Now, to do this properly, you really need to take a whole load of collectivist terms and normalise the data to make everything strictly comparable. And that's what these researchers did. And the results they got look like this. And if we take that data and compare it to the expected Strauss-Howe graph for collectivism, individualism, it seems there's something of a fit. In fact, we can do a statistical test and find that the Strauss-Howe theory explains over 50% of the variation in the data. So that's not a perfect fit, but it's a lot better than not explaining any of it. And it means that something like the Strauss-Howe cycle does seem to underlie the individualism-collectivism dynamic, even though there are other things going on and a lot of random noise superimposed on top. And in fact, the main deviations from the Strauss-Howe line are around the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and again this spike in the early 1940s when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union and it was drawn into the Second World War. Both those things, a communist revolution and pulling together after being attacked, could be expected to cause an upsurge in collectivist language. So those events cause variation that the basic theory doesn't explain. But what is really important is that this suggests the researchers' method of measuring collectivism actually works, and they are measuring what they claim to be measuring, because we get these surges of collectivism when the events of the time would cause us to expect more collectivism. So yes, it's early days, but when we look at Russia in the 20th century, we do seem to get the Strauss-Howe pattern in both compliance and sociability. And if we put the two together, the picture for Russia looks like this. In compliance, we've got the two-generation alternation between moderatism and radicalism, which we can project back to earlier times. And in sociability, we've got the four-generation cycle, with the generations lasting about 20 years and conveniently lining up with the decades. And now we can fill in the generation types. The current young adults, who are of moderate type, also have high sociability. They are collectivist, so they are artists. And before that, we have a radical collectivist generation, who are heroes, and then a moderate individualist generation, who are nomads, and so on. And so we can fill in the turnings using the Strauss-Howe chart. So for the last 20 years, Russia has been in a high. Then before that, we have crisis, unraveling, awakening, high, and another crisis. And one thing we might notice is that the October Revolution occurred in a crisis, and the collapse of the Soviet Union also occurred in a crisis. And it certainly makes sense that both those traumatic events, which were exterior crises, i.e. politico-economic crises, should have been part of a crisis period. Now, the Second World War could be regarded as another exterior crisis, and yet it occurred in an awakening period. But the thing about that is that it wasn't really part of Russia's cycle. Russia got attacked kind of out of the blue. It was what Hitler felt he needed to do, but it didn't have anything to do with Russia's generations or Russia's social mood. Now, it might seem strange that the 1920s and 1930s come out as a high, when the 1930s were the time of a terrible famine caused by collectivization. But in fact, those were times of great progress and optimism for Russia, particularly compared to the Western world. Russia was industrializing and growing rapidly at a time when Europe and America were struggling with the Great Depression. And that highlights the fact that the Russian cycle is out of sync with the Anglo-American one. We can line the Russian generations up with Strauss-Howe's dates for the Anglo-American generations, and we see that Russia is one step ahead, a quarter of a cycle ahead. So while the Anglo-American world has been in a crisis phase, a fourth turning, Russia has been in a high, a first turning. And when the Chicago University polling organization asked Russians if they felt their country was heading in the right direction, 70% said yes. But when they asked Americans the same question, only 40% said yes, which kind of fits if Russia is in a high and America is in a crisis. And this chart by a Russian institute measuring social sentiment in Russia finds that compared to the 1990s, Russian sentiment has been consistently high for the last 20 years. And in fact, I myself visited Russia in 2016, and I was struck by the sense of vigour, optimism, confidence, and increasing prosperity. And at the time, I hadn't done any of this work. But now, looking back, I would definitely say it had the mood of a high. Now, I may have gone off on a bit of a tangent with Russia, but I wanted to show that this theory can work with hard data. So we have the Strauss-Howe books, which can be accused of being anecdotal and astrological. And we've seen that, in fact, the theory has a logical basis, and it can be stated in terms of things we can objectively measure. So we can actually test how well it matches reality. And when we do that, in the case of Russia at least, it tends to work, with the understanding that the theory is an idealization and the real world is more messy. But that's just like the beautiful equations of physics don't work exactly in real situations where there's friction, air resistance, measurement error, and things like that. So in other words, the Strauss-Howe theory is not just lazy stereotyping. It is sensible and credible and needs to be taken seriously. And now, if we look at the generational cycles for Russia and for the Anglo-American world, we can see what's coming next. Russia, which has been in a high, is heading into an awakening, when a young generation is going to start questioning the existing culture and values. and the Anglo-American world is going to move from its crisis into a high, a time of calm and optimism with strengthening communities and a general feeling of improving well-being. So Strauss and Howe wrote their books in the 1990s, and they talked about the fourth turning because that was what lay ahead at the time they were writing. But 2 decades have come and gone. The fourth turning should be on its way out. Now, Strauss and Howe thought it would end around 2025, so perhaps there's a few more years to run. But in the near future, we should be entering a first turning, and that will mean an end to the political polarization of recent years and to the anxiety of COVID, protests, riots, climate change, and what have you. That may seem difficult to believe, but history has a habit of turning things around, and that's because people have agency. They react against the existing state of affairs. They recognize problems and do something about them. So, in a sense, the worse it gets, the better it gets, because the more awareness there is of a crisis, the more action there is to overcome it. After Britain and America had struggled through the Great Depression, only to be plunged into a total war culminating in the explosion of 2 nuclear bombs, who would have thought that the next couple of decades would be characterized by rock and roll, Beatlemania, miniskirts, and a general consumerism, and culminate with the landing on the moon? Well, anyone who knew Strauss and Howe theory would have predicted it. A crisis is always followed by a high. It's no coincidence that the 2 darkest decades of the 20th century were followed by the 2 happiest. As I've said, the worse it gets, the better it gets. But it's still hard to believe. In 1948, when Britain was still on its knees after the war, heavily in debt, still on rationing, George Orwell brought out his novel 1984, and he envisaged a continuing bleak, poor, ugly world of totalitarianism and chronic war. He was projecting forward the trends he had lived through, not recognizing how social mood goes in cycles and trends change their direction with every new generation. Of course, Orwell's intention was not necessarily to make a prediction, but that's how it would be taken. And for a long time, people talked about how Orwell had got it wrong. They said he could not have been more wrong, until recently. And now more and more people are saying that Orwell got it right. And why is that? It's because the generational cycle has come full circle, and now we are in a crisis again. And now Orwell's book resonates once more with the mood of the times, and it's becoming believable. But the cycle is moving on. Soon we'll be heading into a first turning, and once again be leaving Orwell's world behind. It won't happen immediately. The high is a time of recovery, not of uniformly positive well-being. The 1950s still had a lingering darkness to them, with worries about nuclear war and anti-communist paranoia. But in a way, such a time of improvement, when each year is better than the last, is more joyful than a time when things are great but not getting greater. As for the timing of this new first turning, a key question is whether the COVID pandemic is the climax of the current crisis. It's certainly an event that is impressing itself on the childhood generation, giving them a feeling of the threatening nature of the outside world and causing them to be overprotected and suffocated. They have seen people wearing masks, alarming addresses from political leaders, the everyday world closed down. They've been kept at home, not allowed to mingle with other children in school and do the usual sports and activities. We shouldn't underestimate the possible psychological effects that these children will carry, perhaps subconsciously, through life. They have an awareness that society can get into a heck of a mess, and maybe that is even its normal condition, and as adults they will do everything to keep things calm. They do seem to be being set up to be artists like those who were children in the Second World War. So this could be the kind of kick that the cycle gets every crisis. But is it really an exterior crisis in the sense of a crisis over political and economic institutions that leads to them being reformed and founded anew? Perhaps it is, because there are certainly economic effects and new practices like video conferencing as a routine activity. And there's perhaps also political fallout that may get resolved with a change of direction in coming elections. And perhaps some of the parallel movements like anti-racism and climate activism could also be seen as providing the political economic aspects of the crisis. But at the moment, it doesn't really feel as though these issues have reached a cathartic climax. They still seem to be more contentious and divisive than overcome and resolved. So perhaps the real climax is still to come. Strauss-Howe thought the fourth turning wouldn't end until the middle of the decade, and there are certainly several scenarios that could evolve into a serious geopolitical crisis in that time, with Russia over Ukraine, with China over Taiwan, or with Iran over its nuclear program. And even mainstream media are talking about the possibility of civil war in the US. The Guardian, National Public Radio, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Post, Time magazine. All these stories are from January 2022. So we may not be quite there yet, and things could get worse before they get better. But certainly by the end of this decade, we will be in a very different world, a very different social mood, a calmer and happier one. And one of the things we should notice is the end of woke culture. So what is woke culture? Well, I would define it perhaps as a kind of aggressive progressivism. There are various themes within it. It's about being more understanding towards people from marginalised and disadvantaged groups and giving them special help to overcome obstacles they may face. It's about pointing out how past abuses can be responsible for present-day disadvantages and so perpetuate injustice across the centuries. It's about mitigating the threat humans pose to their own environment and livelihood through pollution and overexploitation of finite resources. And these are worthy causes, progressive, yet also aggressive. The approach is highly antagonistic and accusatorial. It separates the world into abusers and abused, with that black and white morality that a 1990s critic feared was developing in the millennial generation. It is destructive. It doesn't just point out and acknowledge wrongs or challenge others' opinions, but must pull down statues and block the ability to speak of those with whom it disagrees. Recently, some people who commentate on the woke phenomenon have drawn up what they call the woke taxonomy, and they have a table with the various strands of wokeism. So racism, climate change, trans are the first three issues. And for each strand, they characterize it under such headings as who are the guilty devils and who are the sacred victims, along with myths, supernatural beliefs, and taboo facts, among other things. Because one of the features of woke rhetoric and ideology is that it simplifies a situation to the point of falsity. In fact, far beyond the point of falsity, to the region of misrepresentation, misinformation, and even self-contradictory nonsense. But having said all this, we need to recognise that reaction to wokeism is to some extent a moral panic, meaning its perception as an existential threat to civilization is somewhat exaggerated. Yes, woke activism does real harm when historical monuments are trashed, when people lose their jobs, when an author is subjected to vitriol. But it's really the tactics that are at issue, not the basic motives. Take racism. Most people in the Anglo-American world are opposed to explicit discrimination based on race these days. There's no real argument there. It's the tactics of shaming and signalling that make it woke and that get on the nerves of people who are not woke. So shaming, like talking of white privilege, and signalling, like the way every company has to have black people in its advertisements. When, for example, the National Trust issues its report on colonialism and historic slavery, which critics find to be totally negative and one-sided, it's an exercise in shaming and signalling. And we also have the signalling of politicians and the police with taking the knee. It may be annoying, but it's not really the end of the world. It's a kind of fad. Again, the core of it, opposition to racism, is something most people can agree on. Everything else, reports and adverts and rhetoric and kneeling, is a kind of theatre. Sure, it can be unpleasant, and when you have NHS diversity officers earning double the salary of the Prime Minister for a 3-day week, it can be expensive and even economically damaging. But I repeat the point that it is still pretty much a game, a fashion, and the important word, a mood. Okay, I'm downplaying it a little, but it's so that you can see, I hope, how wokeism will disappear the same way it came. It's a fashion, so it can go out of fashion. It's a mood, so it can pass. The aims will remain, things like fairness, tolerance, opposition to racism, the basic substance of it. What will disappear is the presentation and style, the shaming and signalling, the intolerance in the name of tolerance, the racism in the name of anti-racism. So yes, we have this taxonomy of wokeness, and on the left we have a menu of issues, and these things will continue to be of concern. We all know that young people tend to be idealistic, compassionate, utopian, naive, a bit misguided, everything like that. It's a key part of the Strauss-Howe theory, Aristotle's principle. Young people react against the world they see, rectifying its problems, not realizing how their solutions have problems of their own. That's how it is, and that's how it always will be. And there's a poetic justice to this, because the society that young people create, with all its flaws, is the one that they will have to live in when they are old. So if you are old and you think the world is going to hell in a handbasket and you want to know who made this mess, well, it was you. When you were young, whether through action or inaction, you let the world get this way. And if you're young, remember that you are going to have to live with the consequences of what you are doing, not just now when you are young and full of reforming zeal, but also when you are middle-aged and when you are old, and when your priorities might be quite different. Anyway, this menu of issues is by no means original and will not go away. People have been concerned about civil rights, poverty, gender fairness, and things like that since I was a child and long beforehand. But it's everything here on the right that belongs to today. All this mythology and victimology is a product of the present crisis. It reflects the mood of this era and the character of the generation in the youth bracket. So yes, the debate is polarised and intense because we're in a crisis. Yes, the activism is combative and groupthinkish because this is a generation of radical collectivists. And in saying that, I don't mean it as a disparagement. Let me give an anecdote. In the Korean War of the 1950s, there was a lot of concern about the way the communists inflicted so-called brainwashing on their prisoners of war. And what brainwashing consisted of was a kind of enforced indoctrination concerning the wonders of communism and browbeating prisoners to express their acceptance. And the result was that most American prisoners cooperated in some way with the enemy, usually just signing statements of agreement with communist principles, though some wrote letters to their families promoting communism, and a few made radio broadcasts in favour of communism. But there was a hard core of American GIs who refused to cooperate with the communists in any way. One of them told how after he was captured, the communists were interrogating him, and they asked him, "What do you think of General MacArthur?" MacArthur was in command of the Pacific during World War II, and he also led the UN forces in Korea. And the captured GIs said, "General MacArthur is a great American soldier." And the communist guards beat him to the floor with their rifle butts. Then they dragged him to his feet and asked him again, "Now what do you think of General MacArthur?" And he answered again, "General MacArthur is a great American soldier." And he said that after that, the communists pretty much left him alone. They realized they weren't going to get anywhere with him. And this GI and others like him were hailed as heroes for standing up to the brainwashing program. And after the war, a psychological study was done, to see what was special about these characters that maybe could be used to train other soldiers. And it was found that these resistant GIs mostly had bad disciplinary records. Basically, they were people who had a problem with authority. That's how they behaved in the American army, and they continued that pattern of behaviour when they were taken into captivity. In one context, they were troublemakers. In another, the bravest of the brave. So the point of this story is that whether people are heroes or villains depends very much on the context. The traits that make someone, frankly, a pain in the arse in one situation can be exactly the traits that you want in another situation. So the radical collectivism of today's millennials may seem destructive and unreasonable when it hasn't got anything to work against. But if society is really tested, as it would be in a war, radical collectivists are just the kind of people you need. They're the ones most likely to rise to the challenge. And that's why Strauss and Howe call them heroes. This woke taxonomy also suggests to me precisely how wokeism is getting rather fragile and looking like it could disappear in a puff of smoke, because it's bloated and multifaceted. There's just so much of it. It's got to be increasingly difficult to find people who can sign up to all these tenets, especially when not a few of them challenge logic and reason. Even woke activists are likely to have some personal experience or knowledge that causes them to reject or make light of one aspect or another. And this could make the whole thing begin to unravel. In fact, we're already seeing the progressive worldview struggle with internal contradictions in the case of the conflict between so-called TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, who believe that the term women should be reserved for those born with female reproductive organs, and supporters of transgender rights who believe that men can become women by declaring themselves to be such, even if they still have male reproductive organs intact. It's not just a struggle about a word or label. Being designated a woman provides access to women's social roles, including access to women's spaces, and TERFs perceive the presence of people with men's biological capacities in places like women's prisons and changing rooms as a physical threat. And I don't want to get into the whole debate, of which what I've said is just a sample, and I just want to make the point that feminism, by denying that biological endowment should define social role, has provided some of the rhetorical groundwork that transgender activists can draw on to press their point of view. And that's important because it shows how this edifice of progressivism contains flaws and arm passes that are now, in the present crisis, coming to be exposed. And this is why the whole thing may fall apart, moving society onwards into a first turning. Something like feminists saying, okay, we'll go back to being women if you can stop men pretending to be women. And there's another point I'd like to make, which is included in this table, where it talks of the elect, those chosen to make things right. And this is that over something like racism, it's not really a struggle of one group against another, as it appears to be. It's not really a battle of victims against oppressors. It's coming from people who presume to speak on behalf of the alleged victims. And these victim defenders can even be from the nominal oppressor group. So black professionals don't necessarily welcome the idea that race is their most important characteristic and that it means they will always be victims of white superiority. There are some highly articulate black commentators who speak out against the woke ideology, only they tend to be marginalised at the moment because their viewpoint is out of sync with the social mood. I mention this because if it were a real struggle against genuine entrenched injustices, then it's not something that we could expect to end with a change of social mood. But insofar as it's a kind of pose or a kind of mania perpetrated by these elect social justice warriors, then it's something that can indeed evaporate as mood changes, and as being a champion of wokeness or a self-proclaimed victim becomes seriously uncool. And now, I don't want to suggest that everything is perfectly fine and these issues are non-issues. Social problems do exist and need attention, and it could be argued that we need the crisis and something like the woke phenomenon to create the sense of urgency that will help to move them forward. Urgent is in fact Strauss-Howe's word to describe the vision of the future in a time of crisis. So, although I'm talking here about cycles, society doesn't return to its starting point. The human race does actually make progress, even though it can be at a snail's pace and a bit like snakes and ladders. And the cycle is the kind of pump that produces progress, in which innovations arise and their consequences are worked out until society is ready for another round of innovation. So let's think a bit more about the origins of wokeness in terms of the Strauss-Howe theory. Strauss-Howe argue that there's a kind of connection in the crisis between the elder prophet generation and the young adult hero generation. The mental picture they give is that of the elderly Obi-Wan Kenobi inspiring the young Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. The old prophet is the initiator who has the vision. The young hero is the doer who acts rather than thinks. In between is the hard-bitten nomad Han Solo, who is tough, independent, and more concerned with earning a living than with sorting out the problems of the galaxy. So the prophets have the ideas and the heroes put them into practice. The same point exists in Huntington's theory of ideals versus institutions. In what Strauss-Howe call a second turning in the interior crisis, when the prophets are young, society comes up with new ideals. And in the fourth turning, in the exterior crisis, when the heroes are young, society incorporates them as new institutions. So in Strauss-Howe's theory, they say that ideals are discovered during the awakening, then championed during the crisis. In between the two, they are debated during the unravelling, and then in the high, they are settled. Everyone is on board. So what we are seeing with wokeness is the championing of a set of ideas, but these ideas didn't originate in the crisis. It's not the heroes who came up with these ideas. These ideas originated in the awakening, and it was the prophets who came up with them. So civil rights in America emerged as a crucial issue in the 1960s. Environmentalism is the same. The hippies were eco-activists getting in touch with the earth. 3 key eco-organisations, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and the British Green Party, were all founded in the few years around 1970 in the heart of the awakening. So today's climate change activists are working out themes and ideas that originated with their grandparents 2 generations ago. The heroes don't come up with the ideas, they put them into action. The prophets are the rebels. When they developed eco-thinking in the 60s and 70s, they were challenging the establishment. The establishment had not bought into environmentalist ideas. There were no climate summits in those days. But today, the world's institutions tend to be headed by elderly prophets, and they're all on board with environmentalism. Governments and companies all advertise their green credentials. And it's not just environmentalism, but the other aspects of wokeness too. Companies and public bodies express their support for anti-racism and proudly display the rainbow flag. So the hero generation is not rebelling by being woke. Rebellion was for the individualist prophets. As collectivists, the heroes are conformist and conventional, echoing the values of the establishment. As Strauss-Howe say, the prophets see the heroes as the means by which they can achieve their ideals. So prophets initiate, as Strauss-Howe say, with a sense of euphoria, while heroes implement with a sense of urgency. And this shows again how what makes wokeness woke is not the substance, it's the style. Those ideas have been around for a long time now. What's new is the vehemence. And the point is that style can change, after which wokeness won't be woke anymore. Now, if elder prophets are supposed to have passed the baton of wokeness to the youthful heroes, it may seem rather strange that it is often midlife nomads who are actually promoting a lot of it. The head of the National Trust is a nomad, Generation Xer, as are those who compiled its report on colonialism and slavery. In universities, you'll tend to find its midlife academics, Generation Xers, who are removing white males from the curriculum and giving out content warnings. And similarly, in the media, it's Generation X midlifers who are pushing diversity. And I puzzled about this for a while, but I think the explanation is this. The nomads are a moderate generation. They have high compliance. The drive for these things often comes from below, from the youth. In universities, for example, the students campaign over something and the staff embrace it. Or sometimes the drive may come from above, from the elders, the ones who head the university or corporation or government department that goes woke. And the midlife nomads don't stand up to these pressures, which they experienced from above when they were young and in midlife from above and below. They yield, and not begrudgingly, but happily, because that's what nomads are like. They may be tough, but they're also kind of timid. And their individualism means that they don't work together to resist pressure, so they're easily overcome. And they're defined by expediency rather than by passion and idealism, so going with the flow is natural to them. And I think all these factors explain why the nomads have gone woke during the fourth turning. They don't want to get out of line, and while some of them follow the mood of the times wholeheartedly, others go along with it tacitly. Returning to the climate change aspect of the woke agenda, there's another reason why it is likely to lose its force in the coming decades, and this is that we're moving towards the opening up of space, which means that travelling into orbit will become a routine and mass activity, while there will be mining colonies on the moon and people settling on Mars. And these things will make environmentalism, with its slogan, "There is no planet B," seem increasingly out of date. And in his book, The Great Seesaw, which came out in 1988, the Australian historian Geoffrey Blainey describes how what we might describe as environmentalist thinking always comes to the fore at a time when people are feeling the limitations of their environment. They fear they're running out of room and they start to worry about overpopulation. They fear they're using up the resources on which they depend, and so they start to think about sustainability and they hanker for a simpler, less resource-intensive lifestyle. And then when people overcome those limitations, environmentalist thinking dies away again. So the Romantic movement, an early version of environmentalism, arose in Europe in the 19th century when people were worried about the supply of coal, and strong population growth during the Industrial Revolution led to a feeling of pressing ever more heavily on the land. But the opening of frontiers in Africa, Australia, and the Americas, and new travel technologies that increase freedom of movement, and the shift from coal to oil, all produced a sense of there being an abundance of resources with ample space for the expansion of civilization. But by the 1960s, the world had undergone explosive population growth. Hillary and Tenzing had reached the top of Mount Everest, and there was nowhere left to explore. People again began to feel the finiteness of the planet they were on, and they worried about sustainability. That brought environmentalism back onto the agenda. It's said that the first photograph of the whole Earth from space, taken by Apollo 8 in 1968, also raised people's planetary consciousness, making them see it as something precious and vulnerable that needed to be protected. And that perhaps reinforced and helped crystallize the emerging sentiment of the finiteness of the Earth. And now, as we go into space, that would be like releasing the pressure valve. Once it's clear that the solar system is our home, not just the Earth, it will be recognized that there's plenty of energy, raw materials, and living space for humans to keep growing in numbers and in technological activity for a long time to come. Sustainability will cease to be a concern. And the point here is that the finiteness of the planet is a kind of real issue emerging from the circumstances of the late 20th, early 21st century, when humans have filled up the Earth and not yet been able to move beyond it. The generational cycle sets the style in which issues like this are handled, and so we expect the current wokeness style to disappear as we enter the more optimistic era of a first turning. But with environmentalism, there is an extra factor. It looks likely that the substance will also disappear thanks to the colonization of space. And this will help turn the next 2 decades into a high of strongly growing well-being, characterized by the artist's skills of calm, expert, collective management of complex technical challenges. It was a young artist generation that first got men on the moon, and with a first turning ahead, it looks like it will be another artist generation that gets them back again. And of course, women, black people, and anyone else who chooses to go. And here I need to say that I think the media profile of Generation Z gives a wrong impression. Gen Zers are presented as being as woke or woker than millennials. But insofar as today's older teenagers may be like that, I would say they are late millennials, not really Gen Zers. The real Gen Zers will be calmer and happier, without the sense of urgency regarding things like racism and climate change. They, as ever, will react against the world that they find. And when you have 40-year-olds, their parents, declaring their pronouns and sounding shrill alarms over climate, they will neglect such practices without being fanatically against them. The Gen Zers will be moderate collectivists, and according to the Strauss-Howe schedule, their oldest members were born around 2005 and will be entering adulthood proper round about now or in the next few years, and the rest of the generation will follow over the coming 2 decades. And I'd also like to repeat that these characterizations of Gen Zers, millennials and so on are characterizations of generations, not of individuals. It's only a minority of each generation that fully displays its typical core behaviour, while the rest more acquiesce in it, and that is enough to set the tone of an era. And let me review the key theme involving the evolution of woke values. So in the high of the 1950s, woke values didn't really exist. Then in the awakening of the 60s and 70s, these values were discovered, and yet American civil rights and women's lib didn't really feel that threatening to the established order. Then, in the unravelling of the 80s and 90s, these values were being debated and we had affirmative action and multiculturalism. There was even anti-racist mathematics. And by the 1990s, political correctness was becoming a thing. But still it seemed a sideshow, and it was possible to express disagreement. Then finally, in the crisis of the 2000s to today, the values were being championed, and it became clear that these values are to be taken seriously, and society is going to have to change. And the woke project has come front and centre. But this phase will also come to an end. The change will have happened, and the new values will be taken for granted, and we'll be back again in a high when values are settled, but on a new level. And calm will reign for a while until the next cultural challenge comes along, perhaps 20 or 30 years from now. So, to wrap this up, if we go with the Strauss-Howe theory, which on close inspection seems to have a sensible logic to it, and to help make sense of observations and data, then the Anglo-American world is on the cusp of transitioning to a calmer, more optimistic era when society, including all colours, genders and what have you, will pull together, and there will be a long upward trend in well-being. The woke culture will fade away and be forgotten. And if you think that actually woke culture is not fading away but reaching new heights of belligerence and illogic, remember that it is darkest before the dawn. And the date of this move into a first turning is, by Strauss-Howe's reckoning, 2025. So things could get worse before they get better. And that could mean some kind of political or economic calamity, worse than COVID and worse than woke demands, critiques and protests. And if so, not all of us may make it to the first turning. And it could be bittersweet for those that do.